Eberechi Eze, or as I was calling him up to today, Eberechi Eze. He's this black footballer, black soccer player for you in the US. I'll use football from now on. Who has just signed from Crystal Palace to Arsenal, and I'm an Arsenal fan. I'm not that deep into football as I used to be, but I really used to be, and so I still kind of connect myself with Arsenal. I'm still an Arsenal fan at heart, and I look at all the blogs and the vlogs and all that sort of stuff and comment sections, and football has this way of bringing out emotions in men in particular in a way that few other things can. So you go to the comment sections. 1 minute Arsenal fans were over the moon, so happy because they'd brought Victor Gyökeres, spent £60 million after spending weeks and weeks and weeks haggling with the club. Then they had some injuries, to cut a long story short, had some injuries. And then in a day, suddenly they just signed Eze. Now, the backstory to this is that Eze, he's an Igbo, Nigerian heritage, grew up in, I think, Southeast London, I believe. And he grew up as an Arsenal fan, as many, possibly a majority of black boys in London in particular grow up as Arsenal fans, because Arsenal has this hold, this connection that goes back decades. And so he grew up an Arsenal fan, and he actually joined the academy at 8 years old, and he played for Arsenal under in their development teams up till 13. But then he got released, as happens to a lot of players. Becoming a footballer. My sons are both kind of in the grassroots part of football here in the UK. They're pretty good ballers, much better than I was. And it's interesting to see how highly represented black boys and girls, but especially black boys, are in that football world. And even amongst the managers and coaches, you see a lot more presence. Like even in areas where there aren't that many black people as a percentage of the overall, you'll see black men, parents, coaching, and you'll see a lot of players in the teams, black players. There's of course a whole story and a history there of black people here in the UK being kind of, for various reasons, by wider society, potentially also by parents, kind of being ushered into or pigeonholed into, oh, you're going to be good at sport. You're going to be good at football, and not even being considered ready to go into, higher learning, higher academia and that sort of stuff. So there's a story there, which I'll tell in another video, I'm sure. But anyway, there's a high black representation amongst grassroots football, and also in professional football. I believe something like 30% of professional footballers in the UK are black. I think most of those will be black British as well. There'll be a lot of black people from overseas, first or second generation immigrants as well in there. Anyway, so he got released, and then Eze he had like trials with various other teams, and they didn't want him basically. And he, there's a whole story about he was just not going to give up, but he was like starting to wonder, okay, maybe he needs to get a job in a supermarket or whatever. The story is he was going to go and get a job in Tesco's. And then he got an opportunity to sign for a London club called QPR finally, Queen's Park Rangers, West London, another area with a high black population. Then he lit up the show, and then he got transferred. He got bought by Crystal Palace, I think 5 years ago. And in the last 5 years, he's become one of the most exciting, best strikers, best attacking forwards in English football. He's in the England squad, and, he's highly prized, very wanted. And then, so Arsenal bought him. And there's a whole story, that whole story of his like kind of returning back home. Turns out that all through this last summer, he was desperate to move back to Arsenal, to go to Arsenal, because he just won the FA Cup with Crystal Palace, just won the Charity Shield, Community Shields. It was time for him to go to bigger and better things. Palace were willing for him to go and to sell him, get good money for him. And he was desperate to come to Arsenal, but Arsenal were kind of dilly-dallying, kind of, maybe we don't need him because they've got another player called Ifon Nwaneri, which I believe is another Igbo. Anyway, he's a mixed guy, but of Nigerian heritage, who is on their books. Anyway, he joined Arsenal. Let's just cut a long story short. He joined Arsenal, and he seems like a really good guy, really genuine, humble. He's an intelligent guy as well. Apparently, he did really, really well in his school education, just like Bukayo Saka, his new teammate at Arsenal, another Black British of African heritage in the team. And he is also a man of faith, what seems to be pretty strong faith, as he talks about a fair amount, Christian faith, that is. And his interview with Ian Wright, it's just a beautiful interview where, Eberechi is clearly so happy to be playing for Arsenal. When he was unveiled at the stadium, his face was just overcome with emotion, and so that's just like his personal kind of arc there that I wanted to talk about. But I guess a good way, talking about this thing about Black Britain and Arsenal, the interview between Ian Wright and Eze is a good one to start, because Ian Wright, he rewind 30 years ago now or something like that, to the late 80s, early 90s. He joined Arsenal from Crystal Palace at 27 years of age. And he had a lot of rejections. Ian Wright had been rejected by a lot of clubs in his youth. And he became a professional very late, actually. He wasn't even really accepted into the academies. Anyway, when he joined Arsenal now, Arsenal had already become a strong favourite amongst black people in Britain. Why? Because in the 80s now, I remember, I was a child in the 1980s and I liked football. My family were all into football. We used to watch football a lot of the time. But football in the 1980s was a very different beast to football now. Even all this Sky Sports and the big stadiums, Emirates, the Tottenham Stadium, this, that and the other, that wasn't the case back then. The stadiums were crumbling. Football had a big hooliganism problem. And football had a big overt racism problem as well. I just routinely watch matches and you would hear the crowds doing monkey chants every time certain black players would get the ball. And this was just the norm. I understand that back in them days, the National Front, these far-right organisations had a strong presence as well in those football stadiums at the time. And so football wasn't a particularly healthy place. My parents didn't let me go to a football match till I was, I think, about 10, 11 years old or something like that, because of the hooliganism and the fear of the racism and all that sort of stuff. But come now the mid to late 1980s, Arsenal, who were always a big club, but they'd been kind of in the doldrums for a while, Arsenal suddenly got good again. And they had in their team Paul Davis, veteran from the early 80s. Then they had Michael Thomas. These are all black British of Caribbean descent. Paul Davis, Michael Thomas, David Rocastle. Then suddenly this top team that won the league, cups and the league in 1989 had 3 black players in it, whereas you didn't really see that often. Then they started to get more players in as well. Kevin Campbell, got promoted from the youth ranks. So Arsenal started to be, obviously they were winning things, so they became a popular, a lot of us young black British people gravitated to Arsenal. Obviously I lived in Leighton in North East London, which, Arsenal was fairly close. West Ham was the closest club. Well, Leighton Orient was the closest club. West Ham were the closest club. They had a bit of a reputation for racism. But Tottenham and then Arsenal are very, very, within probably like 4 or 5 miles. And my brother started going to Arsenal matches and I gravitated to becoming an Arsenal fan. Around about that same time now, Crystal Palace also had Ian Wright, Mark Bright, John Solarco, these black players now, as Crystal Palace started coming up and, punching above their weight a bit. And but Arsenal became a favourite club for black people at that time. And it was a wonder when Ian Wright joined. I remember not that long afterwards, Nike did an advert with him fronting this big billboard advert, TV advert for like football boots or whatever. And that was like unheard of for a black British sports star. Or it wasn't that common. You had Linford Christie, I suppose, Frank Bruno, but for a footballer, it was unheard of for that kind of like, taking centre stage, a black man taking centre stage in that way as a footballer. And so he became, from that time on, Arsenal became really, really big with black people here in the UK. Then going through now the late 90s and then the noughties, you had this new wave of support coming from black Black Brits, and particularly from Africans, because Arsenal now, then you had the noughties generation. You had Ian Wright left, but you had Patrick Vieira, you had Nicolas Anelka, you had Thierry Henry, you had Sylvain Wiltord, you had Nwankwo Kanu joined, Nigeria joined, you had Lauren from Cameroon, you had Sol Campbell, you had Kolo Toure, you had Ashley Cole, you know what I mean? It was, at one point, I believe there was a couple of games where Arsenal fielded a lineup where 9 or 10 of I think maybe only the goalie was Jens Lehmann was the only not black player that Arsenal, played in a few of those games during the Invincibles kind of era. And so that was the time now I started to learn a bit more about how big British football was in Africa. And I started to, contact my cousins more often and my family there. And they were massively into Arsenal in particular, but also Chelsea, Man United and whatnots. But Arsenal has always had like this massive hold on this, almost like on the psyche of Black Britain. And that Arsenal themselves have really started to play into that recently. So of course, they've got Visit Rwanda sponsorship on the side of their sleeve. That's another connection. They're like really reaching into the African fan base and building that market. And then you have, when they had the, last season's away kit, the black one, which was supposedly Pan-African colours, red, black and green, and all that stuff. Arsenal has this hold. And it's ironic in a few ways, because Arsenal, why is Arsenal called Arsenal? And why is the club badge a cannon? It's because the club that's now known as Arsenal Football Club was founded in 1886. And it was called Dial Square, I believe. Anyway, they became the Woolwich Arsenal, the Royal Arsenal. It's called Arsenal because they were made by workers at a munitions factory or a gun factory, or bombs and guns and whatnots factory. A factory where they made weapons. And it was called the Royal Arsenal. This was like one of the official armories of munitions factories of Britain and the British Empire. And 1886, it was around about that time, if you know your history, it was around about that time that Britain was first starting to get its colonies in Africa. That was around about the time that Ghana was, the Ashanti was finally subjugated. That was around about the time that Nigeria, Uganda, Zimbabwe, all of these places became subjugated by the British. And I say it's irony, because some of those guns and bombs and all this sort of stuff that were used as part of that colonizing effort potentially came from that munitions factory, the Royal Arsenal in Woolwich in southeast London, So, this isn't to say that Arsenal was like particularly some terrible club or whatever, but it just goes to show that football reflects and is part of the rest of life, the rest of society, economics, history, culture, all this sort of stuff, class and so forth. So that's that kind of ironic link between Arsenal's history and its current level of support amongst a demographic of people, Black Brits, who, let's face it, why are we here? Why am I here yapping in English? And why did we come, we're here because our countries, our people, our ancestors were colonized, were politically, militarily, economically, culturally dominated and subjugated and by the British Army and the Empire. So, this is society, this is football. It's got all these interesting the connections. And I suppose for me, as I say, I'm a kind of latent Arsenal fan, but for me, the story of Eze is a beautiful story. There's what he represents as well. Whereas that early generation of black players in Britain were all of immediate Caribbean descent. If you think John Barnes, Viv Anderson, Cyril Regis, Laurie Cunningham, Brendan Batson, who actually played for Arsenal in the early 70s. When you think of all of these players, I remember Vince Hilaire, Franz Carr, Tony Daly, even them kind of mans there, they were all of Caribbean descent. All of them of Caribbean. I remember John Chidozie at Tottenham. He was obviously of Nigerian origin somewhat, but all of them were from the Caribbean because that represented Black Britain at the time. And then now we are, fast forward 30 years later, The main chunk, if you look at the Arsenal lineup now, when you look at the black contingent, you see Bukayo Saka, Nigerian. You see Ifeanyi Nwaneri, Nigerian, partly Nigerian heritage. You see, we brought Noni Madueke, Nigerian, I believe, heritage. Now Eberechi Eze, Nigerian heritage. Before that, not that long ago, they had what was his name? Eddie Nketiah of Ghana. They had Thomas Partey last year from Ghana. The demographics, almost like the demographics of the Arsenal first team squad right now reflects the demographics of Black Britain, i.e. very heavily dominated by people like me, people who've either came directly from the continent of Africa or whose parents came from Africa. And that's, this is football, man. It's a very interesting and very interesting time. And I'm recording this video as well, I should say. I'm recording this on Monday, Bank Holiday Monday in May 2025. And I suppose it's fitting that Eberechi Eze joined Arsenal on Bank Holiday Carnival weekend. So today, right now, we almost went to Carnival, but we didn't in the end. But right now, still now, as I'm recording this, hundreds of thousands of people will be in the streets of West London, for the Notting Hill Carnival. And I think I'll talk about the Notting Hill Carnival in future because people dismiss it and ridicule it and talk about it, how it being representing everything that's bad about Black Britain, the Black British experience. But this, for me, is a mistake because the carnival has a deep and rich history, seeped in political struggle, liberation movements, Pan-Africanism, and even, in the interconnection between Black people in all various different parts of the world kind of comes together in the Notting Hill Carnival. So that'll be a topic for another day. But hope you've enjoyed this little deep dive into, or mini deep dive into Black Britain and Arsenal. Hope you've enjoyed it. My name's Eli Wananda. And there are other videos you might be interested in on this channel. There's one here YouTube will recommend. And then there's one here which I think might follow on nicely. All right, take care of yourselves and I'll speak to you soon. Peace.